Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from a viewer, thanks to Smith283 for this one. Amy plays a Thoughtseize targeting Nick, whose hand contains a Jwari Disruption. During his previous game, Nick played this card as a land, and he did not flip it face up in its sleeve before the start of this game. Later, Amy plays a spell, and Nick counters it with that Jwari Disruption. As Nick is reaching into his sleeve to turn the card face up, Amy realizes what's happened and calls for a judge. She says that if Nick had the card the right way up, then she would have realized that it was a non-land card and she would have chosen to have him discard it with the Thoughtseize. What is the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? Alright, so the first and most important thing that we're going to need to do for this question is to establish at what point was the first time that a player did something that was against the rules. Now, there actually is a specific code in Magic's policy documents that governs all kinds of things that you're allowed to communicate or not communicate within a game of Magic. This code breaks down all types of communication into 4 different categories. I'm going to specifically focus on derived information, which is the most important one for our case here. Derived information is basically just any information that a player should be able to have access to, but which might require some sort of skill in order for that player to figure out. And that's important because card text, for example, the card types of one of the cards in Nick's hand, and game rules, for example, the game rule that says that in a player's hand, a double-face card only has the characteristics of its front face, both of those are considered types of derived information. Now, the rules with derived information is that if a player asks you a question about derived information, you're allowed to refuse to answer. And it's also the case that you can make misleading or incomplete sorts of statements or communications about derived information. However, it is not allowed for a player to make false communications regarding this sort of information. Now, I said communications because this is the player communication policy, and it covers both verbal and nonverbal communications. So that would mean that even if Nick didn't say a single word, if a judge believes that Nick made some sort of action or performed some sort of gesture that represented the derived information about cards in his hand incorrectly, well, we would still have a problem. For example, a lot of the time when people get Thoughtseized, it's a kind of common practice to divide the cards in your hand up into land pile and a non-land pile, which can help the opponent focus and make a decision about what card to take easier. If Nick did something like this, and he put the Jwari Disruption in the incorrect pile, well then we definitely would be able to say that Nick performed an action that misrepresented derived information, which would be against the rules. On the other hand, if Nick just put his cards face up on the table in front of Amy and didn't make any other statements or any other kind of nonverbal communication about which cards it might or might not be okay to take, well, then it would be on Amy for not looking at the cards carefully and realizing one of them was a double-faced card and asking to see the front face. So, obviously, if you're the judge taking this call, you would need to do some investigations to determine which of these cases was the one that actually happened. And whether or not Nick is going to be getting a penalty is going to depend on the results of that investigation. If you determine that Nick did do some sort of inappropriate communication regarding the derived information of the cards in his hand, well, that would be considered a communication policy violation. If, on the other hand, you determine Nick did not do anything that was against those rules that I discussed, then you could just have the players continue on. If we were at regular rel, of course, Nick would not be getting a penalty. But all that stuff I said about it not being okay to incorrectly represent derived information, that stuff is still going to be in play, and so Nick still would have done something against the rules in that case. The fix suggested by the IPG that applies at competitive rel I think also works pretty well at regular rel as well. That being that the judge can consider a backup to the point immediately before a player made a decision based on incorrect information that was supplied by their opponent. So in this case, the judge could consider backing up to the point immediately before Amy chose a card to have Nick discard with Thoughtseize. Now, I said that the judge may consider that backup. That means that either backing up or not would both be policy-supported fixes. And this is a part where it gets kind of difficult to say exactly what you should do without knowing a lot more about exactly what happened in the specific case. So if Amy played a spell right away after the Thoughtseize, and there wasn't any other game actions that happened in between there, well, that would probably be a pretty strong candidate for backing up. On the other hand, if this was several turns down the road that Amy played this spell, it would be very much the case that a judge would be way less likely to decide to back up there. So as you can see, there's a pretty wide spectrum there, and where you should draw the line would depend a lot upon how much time had passed and how many game decisions had taken place in between those two times. Now, another thing that really complicates this is that when you're deciding whether to back up or not as a judge, well, that's really going to be determined based on what you think does the least amount of damage to the game state. In other words, you're trying to get the game back into a position that's as close as possible to what it would be if there was no error committed. In cases like this, it's generally going to be the case where whatever you decide, you're going to be ending up pretty far away from what the game state would have been if there was no error committed. And of course, what that means is that a lot of the time when you deliver that ruling, at least one of the players is probably going to be pretty unsatisfied, maybe both of them. Therefore, as a judge, it's very important to have strong communication skills so that you can make sure that the players understand exactly why you made the decision that you did. Even if they don't agree with it, they should at least be able to respect it and continue playing. There's one more point that I'd like to touch on before I sign out. You might be wondering if, when I said that a player is not allowed to incorrectly represent derived information, then what would we have to say about Nick putting the card in his sleeve the wrong way round? Wouldn't that be considered incorrectly representing the identity of that card? And that would be a really interesting point. However, as you can see here, when we're deciding what a player said about the text of a card, and a player shows a card to an opponent, then the card is considered to have its oracle text printed on it. The importance of this line in policy is that just showing a card to your opponent is not enough to constitute a communication violation. That's because the card is considered by the game rules to have its oracle text printed on it, even if there's lots of cards where the oracle text differs, in some cases very materially, from what the actual printed text of the card is. The reason that this policy is in place is because without it, then if you show any card that has any difference between its printed text and its oracle text to another player, that player could try to rule shark you and call for a judge if you didn't specifically say that there might be some errata. The fact that we have this line means that that's not a possibility, even though it does kind of open up the door for some kind of unsatisfying situations like what we have here, where a player shows a card to their opponent that ends up being kind of misleading. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.